Welcome everyone to what is an AGM with a difference. Because of coronavirus, the Strathclyde Pension Fund, the UK's second biggest local authority pension fund, have decided against having an annual general meeting this year. But fear not, because in the absence of an actual AGM, we at Divest Strathclyde are taking the initiative and are holding an alternative AGM of our own. This is something that we're more than happy to do because, as the Strathclyde Pension Fund managers and Glasgow City councillors well know, there is a very important decision to be made, namely whether to continue with their £700 million investments in fossil fuels as climate breakdown happens around us, or whether to break from business as usual and invest in a just and sustainable future. I'd now like to briefly introduce who will be taking part in the formalities today. We have our alternative director of the fund, our two campaigners, our real-life pension fund member Geraldine Clayton from Glasgow, our sceptical councillor who also sits on the fund committee, and myself, the supportive convener, also of the fund committee. We will start with hearing from our alternative director, who will give a report about the fossil fuel assets of the fund. Then we'll be hearing the case for divestment and responses to the views that some councillors hold against it from our campaigners. We'll also be hearing from expert witnesses, our invited speakers, who will be examining the various arguments for divestment. Then we will be taking a vote on the motion to divest the Strathclyde Pension Fund from fossil fuels. To the actual committee and fund managers of the Strathclyde Pension Fund, if you're watching, we encourage you to engage with this content. We present key issues that you may not previously have considered relating to climate justice and updated evidence drawn from recent findings. These combined make the case for divestment even stronger. We will now turn to our alternative director of the Strathclyde Pension Fund, who will provide us with an honest report on the pension fund's performance.
Thanks, convener. The financial managers of Strathclyde Pension Fund have always had a hard line on divestment. In our 2016 climate change strategy, we said that, and I quote, "There is no evidence that oil and gas stocks are a major factor in the fund's carbon footprint. On the contrary, direct exposure to the oil and gas sector contributes a net reduction in carbon intensity." Yes, you heard right. We said that investing in oil and gas makes our investments less polluting. In our AGM in 2018, we described divestment as a blunt instrument. Even earlier this year, we said that the environmental benefits of carbon fuels are well established. But we now have to reckon with the fact that the oil and gas companies haven't changed, with over 95% of their expenditure still in fossil fuels, expenditure funded by us. This is something that activists have been telling us for years, and we're sorry we did not listen. As it stands, our top fossil fuel investments currently include £33 million in Italian oil firm Eni, 70 million in Japanese coal firm Sumitomo, 50 million in ExxonMobil, 12 million in Chevron, 7 million in Royal Dutch Shell, and despite Glasgow City Council declaring a climate emergency in May 2019, we welcomed BP to our portfolio a few months later with an £8 million investment. Just like BP, we see possibilities everywhere.
Can you update us on what our financial support for these fossil fuel giants has helped enable them to do over the past year?
Certainly. Among their numerous projects, ExxonMobil and Eni have been exploiting massive new offshore gas reserves in the Cabo Delgado region of Mozambique, leading to fears that the country has become a climate time bomb. New gas projects by these and other fossil fuel companies are set to increase Mozambique's current annual emissions by 49%, locking this low-income country into carbon dependency for decades to come, while displacing farming and fishing communities and preventing them from making a living in the process. Shell and Exxon knew about climate change decades ago, but chose to hide this from the public and pursue profit. Yet we have continued to invest in them. Right now in Scotland, despite being no longer fit for purpose, they continue to operate ethylene plants in Mossmoran, which process ethane into feedstocks for single-use plastics. Shell and Exxon regularly flout pollution limits, and illegal flaring is a bane to the local community, leading to numerous mental and physical health concerns.
And what about BP?
BP is the newest addition to our fund. BP have been dealing with legal issues this year relating to their greenwashing. They were forced to pull several campaigns which misled the public by focusing on BP's low-carbon energy products, when more than 96% of their annual spend is on oil and gas. On the 4th of August this year, BP announced plans to slash oil and gas production by 2030 and to increase investment in what they describe as low-carbon electricity and energy. This looks like a step in the right direction, but BP is perhaps not the climate change leader that it presents to the public. It was also revealed in August that BP had used money from a low-carbon transition fund to buy shares in companies developing new ways to find and use fossil fuels. BP also announced that it intends to move from being an international oil corporation to a renewable energy-focused integrated energy corporation. Very deep in the announcement, however, was the detail that BP plans to invest up to $70 billion in its fossil fuel and non-renewable energy operations over the coming half-decade. So BP branded themselves as a climate leader, pushing their core message of reimagining energy for our people and planet, while continuing to invest in oil and gas. Oh dear.
And what about fracking?
We have continued to invest in fracking companies. Our support of major players such as Halliburton, Schlumberger and Baker Hughes has driven this sector, enabling the extraction of even more polluting fuels while diverting resources and expertise from the burgeoning renewables sector. Fracking leads to methane emissions, one of the most damaging greenhouse gases, since it warms the planet 84 times as much as carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. Pollution from fracking also risks the health of the local environment and community, with serious concerns raised over numerous instances of contaminated drinking water in the US from chemical and gas leaks. In November 2019, the government halted fracking in England, following the example already set by Scotland and Wales. Strathclyde pension members, therefore living in the UK, will be protected from these immediate health risks, but our financial support for fracking ensures that communities elsewhere suffer. Pennsylvanians are currently fighting to prevent a further pipeline being put in place right next to their homes, bringing fracked gas to Philadelphia from where it is shipped to Grangemouth, Scotland, for the plastics industry. Of course, these are only some of our investments, which include direct investments in over 60 coal, oil, and gas companies, as well as a great deal more invested indirectly, amounting to, let's say that figure again, an estimated £700 million.
Many thanks, Director, for your report. Would anyone like to make a comment? Yes, fund member?
Yes, I would just like to say that I am pleased to be able to attend this AGM today. It's important that the fund should be democratically accountable to its members. I'm fully supportive of divestment for ethical reasons, many of which have been highlighted in the report. The financial arguments for divestment are also very strong, since they affect the fund's ability to guarantee continuing to provide us with the security of a good pension.
Thank you, Fund Member. I would now like to turn to one of our campaigners for divestment, who will respond to the Director's report and who will summarise the case for divesting the Fund's fossil fuel assets.
Thanks very much, Convener. Somebody deeply concerned about the climate crisis, I am delighted to have this platform to discuss the urgent need for divestment from fossil fuel companies. We know that the evidence shows that the vast majority of oil, gas and coal reserves must remain in the ground to limit emissions and contain global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the absolute upper limit of the Paris Agreement. But we know that even more urgent emission reductions are required before 2030 in order to stay below 1.5 degrees. Now, from the point of view of climate justice, and to quote Global South campaigners at COP25 last year in Spain, it's 1.5 to stay alive. Climate breakdown is here now, and it's destroying lives as we speak. I mean, to give only a few examples, we have the Pacific Islands, which are under threat from rising sea levels. We see continual droughts in East Africa and Central America. We have December's horrific wildfires in Australia, and this summer fires in California, and this summer fires in the Arctic Circle. And as well, the terrible floods in Bangladesh and India. And recent catastrophic floods in Scotland too, of course. Now, at what point do you start to acknowledge the way we are doing things just now just isn't working? Well, from the perspective of fossil fuel companies, not yet. BP, Shell and other fossil fuel extraction companies have committed tens of billions of dollars to developing new fossil fuel reserves over the next decade.
Thank you, campaigner. You want to come in here, Councillor?
Yes, I do. I mean, talk of divestment is all very well, and it's easy to say, but we have a duty to invest in companies that generate money to fund our members' retirements. Oil and gas companies have formed a reliable and profitable part of our diverse investment portfolio for years. And while our fund managers and investment advisors continue to recommend them, we would be failing in our responsibility if we excluded them because of ideological reasons.
Caring campaigner, can you respond to this and tell us about the financial case for divestment?
Thank you. I'm glad you asked. Well, there are strong financial reasons for pension funds to divest. One of the main reasons why many pension funds are already divesting from fossil fuels is because of the continuing and growing threat of what are called stranded assets and the carbon bubble. These refer to fossil fuel investments which are no longer profitable. Now, climate scientists agree that the vast majority of fossil fuel reserves need to stay in the ground if we are to take the Paris Climate Agreement seriously and keep global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. This means that trillions of dollars of current investments in fossil fuel reserves will become worthless when the world moves decisively to a low carbon economy and to renewable energy. When these fossil fuel assets cease to become profitable, or when they lose their value altogether, they become known as stranded assets. And this threat of stranded assets is becoming increasingly likely with the ongoing decline in the global fossil fuel industry. Investors with high exposure to fossil fuels in their portfolios will be hurt as those companies and assets cease to make a profit. We say that Strathclyde Pension Fund is in breach of its fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of its pension fund members if it continues to hold fossil fuel stock knowing the financial risks. Of course, it isn't just climate activists like us saying this, although we have been saying it for ages. Financiers are now starting to catch up. Just one example is the ex-Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, who is now the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance and the Prime Minister's Finance Advisor for the UN Climate Summit COP26. Mark Carney has stressed that the window of opportunity is finite and shrinking for us to respond to the threat that climate change poses, both to financial resilience and to longer-term prosperity.
Thank you, campaigner. Could either of you tell us how the coronavirus pandemic relates to our reasons for divesting?
Yeah, I can come in here. So yeah, what we're kind of seeing just now is the first sign that divestment activists have been correct in predicting the carbon bubble. You know, if only we were listening to earlier. Because yeah, fossil fuel companies have had to slash billions of dollars off the value of their assets in response to the coronavirus crisis. In the last 3 months alone, companies including Shell, BP, Total, Chevron, Eni, and Equinor have reported downgrades in the value of their assets, totaling almost $55 billion that is. Major players like Shell have cut dividends for the first time since the Second World War. BP have also announced a record $16.8 billion loss for the second quarter of this year. This is not good news for pension funds like ours, which are invested in this ailing sector. Now, on the other hand, COVID-19 has provided the fossil fuel sector with an opportunity to demand that governments provide financial interventions which undermine the Paris Agreement but protect their bottom line. So ExxonMobil, Chevron, Occidental Petroleum, Devon Energy, Phillips 66, all Strathclyde Pension Fund holdings, by the way, were amongst a group that met with President Trump for this purpose on the 3rd of April. At a time when we so badly need a just and green recovery, many of the fossil fuel companies that we invest in have been doing everything in their power to ensure the continuation of business as usual, which would obviously contravene the Paris Agreement. This would only kick the carbon bubble further into the long grass. But you know, it's still there and it will hurt us further down the road.
Thank you. And can you tell us, caning campaigner, how divestment relates to demands on government budgets?
Yes, absolutely. Well, governments need an additional $458 billion annual investment into low carbon energy infrastructure and energy efficiency if we are to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And pension funds like Strathclyde Pension Fund can make a really important contribution to this. Of course, this sounds like a huge amount of money, but the financial, ecological, and humanitarian cost of doing nothing to reduce climate breakdown is far higher. And the International Federation of the Red Cross estimates that if we don't take urgent climate action now, the number of people needing humanitarian assistance every year due to the climate crisis could double by 2050. Now, it's worth noting that investment funds that exclude fossil fuel companies have consistently performed better than those that include fossil fuels, and this reflects the growing reliability of green investments. Divesting Strathclyde Pension Fund from fossil fuels within the next 5 years is a relatively easy and effective response to the climate emergency. It would also encourage other public bodies, businesses, and individuals to do the same. And this would send a really positive message as Scotland prepares to host the UN COP26 Climate Summit next year. And we cannot ignore the fact that many of Strathclyde Pension Fund's investments in fossil fuel companies and in other extractive mega mining companies are linked to terrible human rights abuses and to harmful impacts on Indigenous communities.
Thank you. And on that subject, I would now like to invite one of our expert witnesses to tell us more about this, Ali Fernandez. Hi, Ali, welcome. Can you tell us, Ali, about how extractivism, which is a continuation of centuries of exploitation by the global north, has impacted the area where you were born and brought up?
Well, thanks so much for having me, and I'll try and keep it really short, but yeah, I'm a member of the Chilean community here. My name's Ali Fernandez. I'm just put together this presentation really quickly. So really, I'm Chilean, but I'm Aymara. I'm part of a really small kind of ethnic minority in the north of Chile, and in an area that's getting mined right now. In fact, I recently found out that Rio Tinto, which is one of the main kind of mining companies these days, together with BHP, these companies are mining in the valley that my family comes from. So actually, that whole valley is under threat of having toxic waters, so it will make it unlivable if that goes ahead. So anyway, yeah. So try and move forward. There we go. So basically, I'm going to do like a really quick 20,000 year history, which is that for 20,000 years, we were a sustainable community. We were farming. We learned to farm the potato and the coca as well, things that are very popular here. Also tomato, corn, alfalfa, a lot of different things. It was basically an agricultural society. For 50 years then, we were conquered by the Inca, which took the kind of work that we did then, which was a very reciprocal economy of different festivals that different kind of groups would work on. So the fishermen would also contribute to what the people who farmed right at the top of the mountain would do. So we had this very kind of long-lasting type of system, which the Inca turned into when the Inca invaded us for 50 years. They created another kind of work, which is called mita, which was the work for the Inca, and the Spanish very soon just took this and put a Spanish leader in front of that, and the same system kind of pretty much continued after that. So they turned our type of work, which was normally communal, into a coercive type of work, which was full of hardship and increasingly a lot of commercial investment from the actual people who were doing the work. So independence of Chile came around the 18th century. This kind of changed this kind of very coercive system, which is based on slavery and on forcing Indios or indigenous people to work in the mines, which then were copper and silver. This kind of became a much more efficient system for extracting basically everything from us, which was when the British Empire became more influential around the world. We started kind of as a Chilean, as a new country, we started to need investors from other countries. So they came in very quickly and bought up all the saltpeter mines, and the copper as well, and gold as well was still produced and still produced now. So a lot of different things are always coming out of these mountains. They're always bringing a lot of things. For us, they were sacred things. For indigenous people, these were sacred things. They contain all the different parts of our relatives and people who came before us. They're something we're supposed to take care of and not be extracting from. So anyway, this also made it very easy to do a colonial system whereby these kind of local governments were very easily bought to do whatever was pretty much the willing of these large landowners, which became pretty soon large mining companies. So today we have a very much more efficient system than this, which was piloted during the Pinochet dictatorship. We actually, the Allende government, which came before that, nationalized the copper mines, but this was never kind of turned around after that. So with this copper mine, this finances a larger part of Chile's economy right now. But also a lot of other areas of our economy is extractive. In fact, the whole neoliberal system that was piloted there and is now being tested, as we see in the US, with people being taken away into unmarked vehicles. This is kind of something that was first tested out in Chile. So this pervades all aspects of life now. It's not just the mines, although we're one of the most mined places on earth. This is something that pervades everything, and this is why we started protesting in October 2019 last year. It was also to do with protests in mines. In the local area where my family is from, this was an pro-water, anti-mining protest. But in other areas, in more city areas, this was something against pensions, which are privatized, health is privatized, education is privatized, everything is basically extractivist. And this is a system that was piloted there so that it can be used here. So stopping it at this point can be stopped by people stopping their savings, stopping everything from being involved in this kind of commerce. And this is why we would ask people to understand these connections that were created so long ago in this colonial system and were never taken away. So in a lot of cases, these conflicts have been going on for a very long time. This is a website here that shows there's about 50 conflicts going on right now to do with, usually to do with water access or water being, as a result of mining, water systems get compromised. So these are usually water protests. And also there's a huge drought problem caused by topsoil and kind of water hungry plantations of things. So this can be also for logging in the south, but mostly in the north, it's to do with wine, or now it's fluoride extraction in my particular valley, which is going to poison the water if they go ahead with it. So these are two kind of organizations in Chile that work towards defending this from a kind of a neo-colonial perspective. They're trying to defend the earth, and some of the people involved in these have been to Glasgow as well. Hopefully they'll come again for the COP things. Also, there's a article there, so hopefully I'll share this afterwards. And it's got a lot more up-to-date information on the mining situation in particular. So I hope that's been useful.
Thanks, Ali. We will now show a couple of videos from the Wet'suwet'en people in British Columbia who are fighting the building of the coastal gas link across their territories. Strathclyde Pension Fund invests in Shell, TC Energy, and Mitsubishi, who are constructing this pipeline. Thank you. Does anyone in the room have anything else to say on the subject of human rights? Yes, Righteous Campaigner?
I'd just like to make a contribution just to highlight yet another abuse that these companies are involved in. So it was recently shown that some of the largest oil and gas companies, including Shell, Marathon Petroleum and Chevron, also back police foundations, which are kind of like opaque private entities that raise money to pay for training, weapons equipment and surveillance technology for departments across the United States. Now, strangely enough, these companies were publicly expressing support for Black Lives Matter at the same time this came out, but that's the only level that they can operate at, like at the level of PR, because their financial prosperity is based on the exploitation, dispossession and, death of communities of colour across the world. This will not change, but we've got the choice to move away from this model.
Thank you, Campaigner. I think our sceptical councillor would like to come in at this point.
Yes, well, many of the oil and gas companies are expanding their green energy sectors, And we can support that through our continued investment. We can also use our shareholder influence to engage with these companies and encourage them to operate in a more sustainable fashion. But if we divest, then we're going to lose that influence.
Thanks, Councillor. Would anyone like to respond to this? Yes, caring campaigner.
Thank you very much. Yes, I believe what our sceptical councillor is voicing here is the idea that we can use our investments in companies to influence their decision making and persuade these companies to transition to more ethical and sustainable activities. In the case of the fossil fuel sector, this argument suggests that our investments mean we can have a voice at the table and persuade huge polluters to move away from coal, oil and gas to renewable energy. In the world of investment, this is known as engagement, and it's often put forward as an argument by the financial managers of Strathclyde Pension Fund as a reason not to divest. However, decades of engagement with fossil fuel companies have, unsurprisingly, failed to move them away from their core business model of extracting and burning fossil fuels. The amount of capital expenditure that fossil fuel companies have invested in renewables has been pitiable. It was just 1% in 2018. I think it's fair to say that in this crucial time, engagement with these companies has been an unqualified failure.
Thanks very much, caring campaigner. I see that our sceptical councillor would like to speak.
Yes, well, I've also got concerns about the workers in fossil fuel industries and the possibility of large-scale redundancies if we pull the plug and divest from them.
Yes, to respond to those concerns, we would like to call on another of our expert witnesses to talk about a just transition. We'd like to welcome Cara Wilson from Young Friends of the Earth, who is involved in the Decent Jobs on a Living Planet podcast, which you should definitely check out. Hi, Cara. Firstly, just transition is quite a popular term these days, but to save the meaning from getting lost, can I ask you to briefly define the term?
So I think it's important to mention that a just transition often means different things to different people. And even though it seems like a fairly straightforward term on the surface, it does involve many different aspects. So taken from a number of different sources, the idea of a just transition is essentially about bringing together social and environmental concerns. And it's a term which refers to a wide range of issues, both on a domestic and also on an international level. It's about recognising and addressing the unequal impacts that a shift of our society away from fossil fuels will have on different groups of people. So in the specific context of the oil and gas sector in Scotland, a just transition would involve protecting the livelihoods of affected workers and communities during the transition towards greener forms of energy. A just transition is one which also recognises the social and economic changes which are necessary to transform all sectors of our society. And on a global level, a just transition would involve providing support, including finance, to the countries which are most at risk of and least able to adjust to the effects of climate change, as well as those which bear a low historic responsibility for global emissions.
And secondly, it's no secret that the current times have been quite hard on the oil industry. How have they responded to the coronavirus crisis?
We've seen in the news recently that there's been a significant decrease in demand for oil due to lockdown measures imposed by governments around the world. And in terms of how the oil and gas industry is responding to the current crisis, the Centre for International Environmental Law has reported that these companies have been asking governments for a range of different assistance measures, including bailouts and non-enforcement of environmental laws. The industry has also started a process of downscaling its workforce as a result of physical distancing requirements and reduced profitability. So a recent publication by Oil and Gas UK has estimated that up to 30,000 jobs could be lost in the sector over the next year and a half, with more uncertainty posed by a potential second wave of the virus.
Thanks very much, Cara. We would also like to call on Stephen Smiley, Deputy Convener at Unison Scotland. Stephen also sits on the Board of Trustees for the Strathclyde Pension Fund. Stephen, can you tell us a bit about what your role on the Board of Trustees for the Pension Fund involves? And why did the Unison take the position to support divestment?
I'm Deputy Convener of Unison in Scotland, and I, along with a couple of colleagues, sit on the Scottish Local Government Pension Scheme Advisory Board, which is a bit of a mouthful, I understand, but this is the body which is made up of trade unions and representatives from the employer side, so that's councils mainly, who advise the pension funds on the administration and governance of the 11 pension funds in Scotland. Unison has representatives on all of the pension boards across Scotland, whose job is to oversee the work of the pension committees and administrations in each of the 11 funds. Unison, a number of years ago, adopted a policy in favour of divestment from fossil fuels of our pension funds. And there was two reasons for that. One is we recognise the environmental impact of fossil fuels and that we need to be part of the solution of divesting and stopping the use of fossil fuels, which is causing climate change. But our main priority is about protecting the pensions of our members in the future, people like me who, as a local government worker, I have a direct commitment in having a pension at the end of my career. And we recognise that investments in fossil fuels are not good investments, that the returns that they would give us to ensure that our pensions funds are healthy are not guaranteed in the future as the world moves away from using fossil fuels. So we've argued that to avoid the pension funds being left with the stranded assets of fossil fuels in the ground that are actually not worth the money they once upon a time were, we argue that the pension funds should develop a policy of divestment. And therefore, at this point in time, we would urge Strathclyde to step up their efforts to engage in that process and be saying to the fossil fuel companies that we have investments and we want to see their divestment plans. And if they're not prepared to show that they are part of the solution, then I'm sorry, we would have to start withdrawing our investments from there and looking for alternatives. So Unison's right behind the campaign for divestment of fossil fuels, and we wish good luck to all those campaigning for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, you have a question, fund member?
Yes. In view of the fact that companies will be subject to international mandatory climate disclosure from this autumn, and the cost of production and insurance are set to rise as the era of peak oil is over, it's beginning to look as if continuing to fund these investments is like playing a game of chicken with our pensions. I'd like to understand more about sustainable investments. Do you have any examples of councils that have divested?
Thank you for raising this, fund member. Do we have any questions or reflections? Yes, righteous campaigner?
There are, of course, a growing number of councils who have opted for divestment, including Islington, Lambeth, Waltham Forest, Croydon and Cardiff. And on a global scale, there are 1,244 institutions who have divested a total of $14.6 trillion worth of assets away from fossil fuels. So it has been done before, and it has been done before by a lot of institutions.
Thank you, campaigner. To divest would be a real demonstration of climate leadership by Glasgow City Council, especially since Glasgow is hosting the UN Climate Conference COP26 next year. We would now like to introduce our next expert witness, Ailey Robb, who is COP26 coordinator at UK Youth Climate Coalition and a member of Glasgow Calls Out Polluters. Hi Ailey, You have written about the PR efforts of oil and gas companies. Why do these companies want to have such a positive image, and why are they so scared of divestment?
The oil and gas industry are having their smoking kills moment right now, if you will. Back in the 50s, the tobacco industry were hit really hard when the science came out that smoking was indeed bad for human health. And their reaction was to spend millions, if not billions, on convincing consumers otherwise. That's where we're at right now with the oil and gas industry. We've seen their huge greenwashing on public billboards. We know they're lobbying governments behind the scenes. And just 2 years ago, the 24 biggest oil and gas companies in the world spent only 1.3% of their budget on renewables. Yet, the majority of their ad campaigns suggest they're investing heavily in massive renewable infrastructure. And now they have a brand new tactic. So since the rise of the Fridays for Future movements all across the world, the oil and gas industry have picked up that young people are a really great way to promote their work. So we're seeing more and more young people and youth on the cover of their ad campaigns, in their television adverts, in their social media, in their marketing, you name it. So the oil and gas industry have switched from greenwashing to what we now call youth washing. And frankly, it's gross. It makes sense that the oil and gas industry want to uphold a positive public image. I think if they spent half the money actually investing in renewables rather than telling us about their investments in renewables, they'd be a lot closer to the change we actually need to see. The investment movement's biggest strength is that it literally puts its money in the places that matter and pulls its money from the places that don't. And government will see that, and when we recover from coronavirus, I think that's where the opportunity comes to put that money into a proper transition and build back better and funnel money into a Green New Deal and all that good stuff. And I think that's when the oil and gas industry will recognise the power of divestment. Right now, I think they still believe themselves to be safe, and I think that's where they're wrong.
Thanks very much, Ailey, and many thanks for all your contributions. Are there any further questions or comments from anyone? Yes, Councillor?
Yes, I mean, how will divestment affect the main concerns of ordinary people in Glasgow? I think people are more concerned about their bins being emptied on time.
Thank you for raising that, Councillor. I see, Caring Campaigner, you have your hand up.
Thank you very much, Convener. Yes, I think the Councillor is raising a very important question about how our pension fund investments have an impact on our daily lives. And they have a huge impact. The west of Scotland is at serious risk of flooding as sea levels rise due to global warming and melting ice sheets. And a recent map by Climate Central shows that large areas of Scotland are likely to be underwater by 2050 if we do not take action to protect the climate now. The cost of mitigating against greater flooding of areas of Scotland as a result of fossil fuel-driven climate change will be a huge burden on all council budgets, and that leaves even less money for tackling everyday issues like recycling and bin collection. So, if we remove Strathclyde Pension Fund's investments from climate-wrecking fossil fuel companies and reinvest them in ethical alternatives, that could protect our council funds to pay for the key services which we all need. It's also very important to note the fact that communities around the world are already suffering the devastating impacts of the climate crisis. And as one of the first countries to industrialise, we have a responsibility here in Scotland to stop funding the companies which are fueling climate breakdown.
Thank you for making the link between divestment and the everyday lives of pension fund members and council constituents, Campaigner. Fund member and campaigners, do you have any closing remarks? Yes, pension fund member?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I'd just like to say that it's been interesting listening to our local campaigner and the expert speakers today. As a pension fund member and a Glasgow resident and as a grandmother, I am worried about the environmental legacy we are leaving behind. I won't be here when the full effects of climate change are felt, but my children and grandchildren will be. I think the greatest dangers, both ethical and fiscal, now lie in us not being ready for the changes that we know are coming. My pension has up till now been part of the problem, and I want it now to become part of the solution. And the first step, I believe, is committing to divesting from fossil fuels.
Yeah, and the Strathclyde Pension Fund has already invested in some good projects, including like renewable energy and affordable housing. But it needs far more of these positive investments instead of fossil fuels and fracking, which as we know, continue to cause climate breakdown.
Thank you both. All the evidence presented to us today amounts to a convincing case for divestment. So let's now proceed to the vote on the motion to divest from fossil fuels. Will those who support the motion please raise their hands? And that is carried. Thank you everyone, and especially to all our guest speakers.